I came to be interested in nuclear power through Chernobyl, because I'm originally from Belarus, and it's a former Soviet republic which was the most affected by Chernobyl disaster, although it didn't have nuclear power on its territory then. So I sort of grew up with Chernobyl, and Chernobyl was part of our lives, but we didn't talk about that much. And so when I came to study to France, I was surprised how much Chernobyl means for French people. So that made me thinking about why we are not interested to understand Chernobyl in Belarus and what's going on with the memory of Chernobyl in Belarus. And that's how I got interested in this topic. And after writing my dissertation on the memory politics of Chernobyl disaster, I started to be interested more in longer history of nuclear energy and nuclear technology in general in Belarus and in former Soviet countries and in the world. There are indeed a lot of discussions today about whether we really need nuclear energy to cope with climate change. And I think there are two temporalities in this question. I think those who tout nuclear energy as clean and safe are talking about more about the future of the nuclear energy. And in a way, nuclear energy was always a technology that was promoted through promises of radiant future. But there is another temporality, the temporality, the past temporality. And I, as a historian and political scientist, cannot say that nuclear energy is clean and safe, because when we study the history of nuclear energy and nuclear technology, both, so to speak, peaceful and military, there is a lot of stories of waste, contamination, disaster, poor management of different aspects of nuclear fuel cycle. So the history really teaches us to be very cautious in our in telling that nuclear energy is clean. From the history, we learn that governments become interested into solving this question, then there is a really pressure from the public. So the more publicly discussed these issues are, the less secrecy there are, the more money and thinking is dedicated to solving this problem. And for me, as a historian, task is in a way to make these problems visible in the public sphere, and also to understand how certain aspects and certain type of wastes are invisibilized in the public sphere. For example, today we really focus a lot on finding a final solution to the high-level waste problem. The spent nuclear fuel or the products of reprocessing of the spent nuclear fuel. And it looks like all the public debates around waste are focused really on this problem, which is a serious problem, but it's only one aspect of nuclear waste. And there are other aspects of it, especially from historical point of view, the accumulated waste that also need to be solved, but they're not discussed as much as the spent nuclear fuel. Since I only recently started to work on a global overview, historical overview of the radioactive waste problem, it's a bit hard for me to give a definitive answer, but what I notice is the public attention to this problem has been quite uneven. So there are periods in time, maybe they depend on some specific political, geopolitical, social context where there is really a lot of public attention suddenly to particular aspect of that problem, but then the problem again reframed as mainly technical, and the public agrees sort of with that. And the public debates again calm down, and the problem disappears from public attention. So it's a very uneven and sometimes also unpredictable. And of course, there is an effort by the industry, by different nuclear organizations, national and international, to try to contain public protest and sort of narrow down the public attention by narrowing down the definitions of what is waste and what is radioactive. For example, spent nuclear fuel in some countries, especially with the nuclear military history, is not considered as waste. It's considered as a resource that you can reprocess and then extract uranium, plutonium out of it. And this reprocessing is presented as a green technology, although in reality it is not green at all, because it produces a lot of toxic waste, and this is a process that is very costly. Or, for instance, the depleted uranium that also is produced during the nuclear fuel cycle, nuclear fuel fabrication, is also considered in some context as resource. For instance, Russia has been importing this depleted uranium from other countries in exchange. Of course, it's a paid service. So Western countries such as France or Germany were sending these waste to Russia, but Russia was touting and presenting it as a resource, although this depleted uranium is simply stored and nothing is done with it. So, and such sort of rhetorical and legal strategies of narrowing down of what is waste is also a way to sort of manage and preempt public protests. I think historically, the decision to site a nuclear power plant has usually encountered much less public resistance than the decision to site a nuclear waste repository, for rather clear reasons that nuclear plant will produce energy, will create jobs. It's something, it's a prestigious enterprise, which of course is safe, as its promoters always claim. And it's also has sort of rather limited life, 30, maybe 50 years, and then it's decommissioned and if all goes well, dismantled entirely. But nuclear repository, and especially the repository for high-level waste, is there for hundreds and even thousands of years, and it doesn't really produce anything. So it's mainly just hazard that is in, so to speak, in your backyard. So this historically really produced a lot of resistance, and people learned that nuclear enterprises and state officials really decide to choose their places the best possible place for nuclear repository. So people are usually much more opposed to a nuclear waste repositories than to nuclear power plants. And not just any nuclear waste repositories, because surprisingly, low-level, intermediate-level waste repositories, because the waste is there, is less toxic, never really, rarely meet such public resistance, with exception of several cases. Although one would think it's still waste that will stay there long enough, and it's still dangerous. But the deep geological repositories are really the ones that people the most. Historically, this decision was presented as a merely technical one, that one would look at the best geology available, probably for sparsely populated regions. So there is less potential danger for people. But when nuclear enterprises started to, and research institutions started to do test drills in several countries, not really discussing this with the public, they encountered a strong opposition. And that's how, with time, the terms of this debate change. And now it's widely admitted that citing the repository for radioactive waste is never just technical question. It's also social, political, even cultural. And of course, social political means different things for nuclear officials and for the public, but still there is an acknowledgement that public need to be taken into account, and these repositories need to be discussed with the public. And actually, what now often happens, that the repository is cited in a place or in a community that already hosts some nuclear installations, a power plant most often. So there is familiarity with nuclear technology there. So that sort of allows for acceptance of the repository. It's a very interesting and complex question. And there is something that is, for me, obvious, but it's sort of completely hidden, is the fact that, so we talk a lot about European dependence on Russian oil and Russian gas, but very little, we hear very little about European dependence on Russian nuclear technology, on uranium, on enrichment, and on the nuclear fuel. For instance, there are several, a dozen of Soviet design reactors in the country of Central and Southern Europe that use nuclear fuel fabricated by Russia. But there are also other technological dependencies between Russia and other countries in the world, and in Europe in particular. But this is something that is not discussed. And although Russia basically, has stolen a nuclear power plant, and is shelling this nuclear power plant and creating an extremely dangerous situation. And European countries, international organizations, first of all, International Atomic Energy Agency, were basically incapable to do anything about this very serious risks. But even in this context, the sanctions against Rosatom, Russian nuclear enterprise, are not discussed. Some countries like Czechia and Finland started to cut ties with Russian nuclear enterprise, but otherwise this subject is very little discussed. So I do think it will impact nuclear industry a lot. But for now, what we see is that the risk of this impact, the nuclear industry tried to sort of contain this damage, and instead promotes nuclear energy as the alternative to Russian gas and oil. So my favorite book is a book by Olga Kuczynska, who is a professor at Pittsburgh University. And it's a book about Chernobyl, the politics of invisibility. It's not a book in history of science. It's more a book on sociology of science and science communication. But I think it's really the best book which explains how we know so little about radiation health effects of Chernobyl, and in general how invisible are the risks of many contemporary technologies in public space, and how hard it is to make them visible.